Chapter 691. Mrs. Shun also noticed the bruises on Xian Zhongshan's neck. She stared blankly at him, muttering to herself, "That bastard! That bastard!" Tang Yu clenched his fists as he watched Mrs. Shun carefully caress Xian Zhongshan's neck. Then, she took out a box of medicine from her bag and carefully applied it for him. Mrs. Shin knew that Xinlian had done it. So, what did Xian Zhongshan's sudden dementia have to do with Xinlian? Tang Yu pursed his lips. Mrs. Shin did not speak to them, as if they did not exist. After a while, she pushed him away. "Tang Yu, aren't you going to ask?" Pei Chi tugged at his sleeve. Tang Yu lowered his head to look at her and smiled faintly. "Mrs. Tang, you don't like me asking about my ex-girlfriend? That's different." Pei Chi looked at the back view of Mrs. Shin pushing Xian Zhongshan in the distance and said pitifully, "I feel a little sad when I see it. If Xinlian had been the one who had splashed her with acid in Xian Zhongshan, then Xinlian was not far from losing her mind." Tang Yu grunted and said softly, "Chi, we won't be like this. He would take good care of her. Forever, he would only have her." The bodyguard bought the ice cream, but Xian Zhongshan had already left. Pei Chi looked down and then looked up at Tang Yu. "Eat it." Tang Yu refused. "Pei Chi, I'm not a child." Pei Chi insisted, "But sometimes you are a child. For example," she glanced at him. As a man, as Pei Chi's man, Tang Yu immediately understood. There was no one around. He lowered his voice and said, "Chi, are you talking about when I eat you?" Pei Chi blushed and stuffed the ice cream into his hand. "Eat it." Tang Yu took it and felt much better. In fact, his Chi wasn't that dumb. He chased after her and grabbed her hand. His voice was filled with adoration and adoration. "You're walking so fast. You should be more careful." "Oh," she replied and slowed down obediently. Then she bit her lip and said, "Tang Yu, the baby kicked me again." Her brows were furrowed and her watery eyes were brimming with tears. She grabbed his hand again. Her long hair was let loose, and her features were exquisite. She didn't look like a mother at all. Without looking at her belly, she looked like a little girl. Tang Yu's heart softened. He squatted down and put his face on her bulging belly. He felt the little hands and feet wriggling inside. His emotions were a little stirred. Life was really magical. He put his finger on her lower abdomen and greeted the little guy inside with a smile. "Hi, I'm Daddy. Be nice to Mommy and don't bully her. Otherwise, I'll spank your little butt when you come out." Pei Chi played with his black hair with her fingers. "You're so small. How can you understand?" At this moment, Tang Yu was no longer the noble and aloof president of Shangyuan, but her husband. There was no sense of distance between them. Just as he said, he wasn't a god. Tang Yu was just an ordinary man. In front of her, he was just an ordinary, sexy, and charming man. He wasn't omnipotent, but he was really good to her. Chapter 692. He patted her butt. "Naughty." Pei Chi giggled and hugged him tightly. "Tang Yu, how can I be so happy?" Mr. Tang stood up and pinched his little face. He coughed and said, "Miss Pei, I can only say that you slept with the right person." She glared at him. Tang Yu looked at her and said, "Weren't you the one who entered my room? Weren't you the one who touched me and kissed me?" He was putting on a high profile again. Whenever Mr. Tang wanted to bully her, he would show such an expression. Pei Chi had fallen for it before, but now she was being naughty. She hugged him shamelessly and said, "No, it was you who couldn't resist the temptation." She hugged him with her belly between them. It was a little funny. Tang Yu put his finger on it and smiled. "When the baby comes out, I'll let you know whether I can resist the temptation or not." Pei Chi could imagine countless scenes just by listening to it, in the bathroom, on the sofa, on the bedroom floor, and even in front of the mirror in the changing room. It was very creepy. She hugged him tightly and said, "No, then let me seduce our baby, okay?" He said it close to her little ear. After saying that, he found that her ears were red. He rubbed them and smiled. In the afternoon, when Pei Chi was taking a nap, Tang Yu went out for a while. He knew that Mrs. Shun was now living in another house of the Shin family. As for the reason, it was probably the same as what he saw today. The doorbell rang a few times, and a servant came to open the door. She didn't seem surprised to see Tang Yu and said that Mrs. Shun had been waiting for a while. Tang Yu walked in and saw Mrs. Shun sitting on the sofa in silence. She looked a little solemn. Aunt Shun. Tang Yu sat opposite her, and the servant poured him a cup of tea. Mrs. Shun looked up. It had only been half a month since they last saw each other, but her face was already full of vicissitudes. Mrs. Shun's voice was calm. I know what you want to ask, Tang Yu. I don't know anything and I won't say anything. Tang Yu looked into Mrs. Shun's eyes and saw a mass of dead ash. There was not a single ray of light, not a single ray of hope. Aunt Shun. Tang Yu's voice was a little strained. When he was 20 years old, he was facing a group of blonde and blue-eyed foreigners on a high-level international negotiation table. Even then, it wasn't so difficult, because he could tell what those people wanted. Those people had a vision, but Mrs. Shun did not. In her world, there was only the Shin family and Shen Zhongshan. Now, there was no hope at all. Tang Yu could not convince her. Without Shin Zhongshan, Mrs. Shun would not betray her daughter. Tang Yu felt that he had come to the wrong place. I will find an American expert for Uncle Shun. He stood up and paused for a moment. Aunt Shun, Jinrong is awake. I believe that one day, a miracle will happen to Uncle Shin. Mrs. Shun's gaze fell on Tang Yu's face. After a long time, a glimmer of hope flashed in her pair of eyes that had aged a lot. But soon, that glimmer of hope was extinguished. She kept looking at Tang Yu. Tang Yu sighed in his heart. At this moment, his phone rang. Before he could answer, the door opened. It was Shun Lian who appeared at the door. Her expression was flustered, and her hair was a little messy. Her gaze swept between Tang Yu and her mother. Chapter 693. Tang Yu lowered his head and looked at the untouched cup of tea on the table. He smiled faintly. I'm here to see Auntie Shun. You can ask me anything. Shun Lian's voice was a little tense as she looked at Tang Yu. Let's go out for a cup of coffee. Tang Yu nodded at Mrs. Shun and went out with Shun Lian. When they were outside, Shun Lian couldn't hold it in anymore. She sounded flustered and exasperated. Tang Yu, why did you get people to spy on me? No, that was no longer spying on her. It was watching over her. No matter where she went, there would be 8 bodyguards watching over her and following her wherever she went. Other than her house and when she went to the toilet, the 8 of them were inseparable like ghosts. She was going crazy. Tang Yu stood in front of the black sports car and took out a cigarette from his pocket. He was addicted to smoking again recently. He took it out and lit it. Shun Lian, do you have any evidence that I did it? Just like how he couldn't find any evidence that she had done anything to Chi-Chi and Shen Zhongshan. Shun Lian's eyes narrowed. She glared at him and saw the 8 people around her. She held her head and screamed, Tang Yu, get them to leave. Leave. He was still calm and collected, calmly smoking his cigarette. I told you to leave. Did you hear me? Shun Lian was panting. She felt like she couldn't breathe. Even when she went to the toilet, there were 8 men guarding outside. They looked at her as if she was a monster. Shun Lian found it difficult to breathe. Even when she turned off the lights at night, she still felt that there were 8 pairs of eyes staring at her in the dark. Her hair stood on end. Tang Yu looked at her and put out the cigarette in his hand. He sneered. Shun Lian, when you were doing this, did it ever cross your mind that he was your father? Maybe the law will punish you, but human nature will. In the dead of night, aren't you afraid? Don't you tremble when you look into his eyes? Shun Lian's pupils contracted. She looked at Tang Yu with a judgmental gaze. What did he know? Did he know everything she had done to Shin Zhongshan? Or did he know about Pei Chi-Chi's parentage? After a long time, she sneered. What makes you think that? Tang Yu didn't say anything. He just opened the car door and left. Shun Lian watched him leave in a daze. She didn't expect him to give up so easily. She chased after his car and screamed crazily, Get them out of the way. Tang Yu, do you hear me? However, he drove very fast and soon, she couldn't see his car anymore. Shun Lian watched from afar as her body slid down. Why? Why do you have to be so heartless to me? She slid down and sat on the ground in her high-end suit. She had no family, no Tang Yu, and even no freedom. What use did she have for that lousy company? Xin Lian's face was filled with tears as she murmured, Tang Yu, all of this is for you. But you, why don't you want me? What's so good about Pei Chi? The 8 men stood behind her, still like phantoms, watching her with cold eyes. They were from the special forces and weren't very sensitive to emotions. Xin Lian suddenly turned around and glared at them. She said fiercely, Go away, you bastards, bastards. What right did they have to watch over her like that? Chapter 694. When Tang Yu returned to the hospital, the room was quiet. Pei Chi was still asleep, lying on her side on the white hospital bed. Her black hair was spread across the pillow, and her little face was fair and adorable. Tang Yu walked in slowly. His originally dark thoughts were slowly being washed away. Seeing her, all the darkness seemed to have been driven away. He was afraid of losing her, so he had to be sure. Before finding out the truth, the most important thing for him was to protect Chi from harm. Moreover, Chi had promised not to go to the company and would stay at home to recuperate. Pei Chi woke up and opened her eyes. She was still lying down and looking at him. Her voice sounded a little lazy after a nap. What's wrong? You don't look too good. Tang Yu smiled. Our Chi knows how to care about people. He leaned against the headboard, and she naturally buried her little face in his chest. She stretched out her arms and hugged him, yawning. Tang Yu, I still want to sleep. Tang Yu patted her little head. Chi, sleep if you want to. I'll watch over you. After a while, her breathing became even. Tang Yu thought that she had fallen asleep and lowered his head to kiss her. Just then, Pei Chi's voice sounded a little muffled. Where did you go just now? He laid down slowly with his forehead against hers and said softly, I went to see Mrs. Shun. She moved out. There was a hidden meaning in his words. Pei Chi opened her eyes and looked at him. Tang Yu only wanted her to know what he wanted her to know. As for the rest, he would not tell her if it was not necessary. In her heart, Pei Mingyi was the perfect father, so she always kept that wonderful impression in her heart. Pei Chi looked at him for a long time before she said softly, What should we do then? Mrs. Shin doesn't want to say. There's nothing we can do for now. Tang Yu reached out and pushed her hair aside. Chi, do you want me to use the same method to deal with Shenlian? She shook her head and buried her face in his chest. How could she? Shenlian was crazy, but she wasn't. Tang Yu held Pei Chi in his arms. What he didn't tell Pei Chi was that the reason why he hadn't really touched Shenlian was because he was suspicious of something. This made him indecisive. But in the end, his decision became the last straw to clutch at. A month later, Pei Chi was released from prison. Her belly was also bigger. When she returned to the rose garden, it was already autumn. The baby was almost 6 months old. After staying in the hospital for a month, her lower abdomen was as round as a balloon. If she had not known beforehand, she would have thought that there were 2 babies inside. Dr. May had revealed that it was a girl. The happiest person in the Tang and Lin families was Old Master Lin. Old Master Lin didn't have any girls in his grandchildren's generation. He was used to seeing rough skin and flesh. The thought of giving birth to a girl as beautiful as Pei Chi made him excited. However, Old Master Lin was very reserved. When others said that he was happy, he would curl his beard and wave his hand. It's just a girl. What's there to be happy about? However, he was secretly happy, especially when he looked at Tang Yu's little wife. Looking at her skin and flesh, he couldn't help but feel happy. She was so beautiful, and with Tang Yu's excellent genes, she was the crystallization of beauty and wisdom. Old Master Lin happily finished his visit and took a car back. It was already 9 o'clock at night. Pei Chi leaned against the headboard and watched Tang Yu handle business. He was really working hard. He had to take care of her and manage a few companies at the same time. Pei Chi misunderstood. She did not feel any sense of crisis. Instead, she smiled and said, Your money is my money. Tang Yu nodded. That's right. So, you kissed me all over. To be fair, I kissed you all over. Pei Chi was stunned. Pei Chi was stunned. Pei Chi covered his face. Tang Yu, you were so bad. Chapter 696. Everything was done carefully, for fear of hurting her. At first, he was joking. After all, he really wanted to tease her. But after that, everything changed. His breathing became rapid, and so did hers. Her little hand grabbed the bedsheets, and her voice was a little hoarse. "Tangyu, are you done?" She was really scared and weak. She looked up at him, her eyes wet. Tangyu kissed her desperately, as if his whole body was on fire. A man who had been intimate for a long time could not be solved by a kiss. But he was still worried about her pregnancy, so he held back no matter how uncomfortable it was. He turned to her side, hugged her, and kissed her ear comfortingly. "Be good. Don't be afraid." But that little person nestled in his chest, and after a while, she became a little restless and carefully crawled into the front of his bathrobe. Tangyu held back for a while, but he still could not. He grabbed her little hand, and his voice was very hoarse. "Chi-Chi, you are playing with fire," she said softly. "I am playing with Mr. Tang." He was amused and angry at the same time. After they got married, she was really not afraid of him anymore. "Chi-Chi." He held her little face and looked at her seriously. Pei Chi-Chi did not let him look. Her little face nestled in his shoulder, and she bit him little by little. They had been together for more than a year. How could he not feel the change in her? Although he was a little troubled, he still thought of a way to make his Chi-Chi happy. Of course, he also forced her to make him happy. When Tangyu left early in the morning, he did not wake her up. She was a little crazy the night before, and she was still sleeping like a little pig. Tangyu bent down and reached out to wipe away the saliva at the corner of her mouth. Seriously, she was already so old and was about to be a mother, but she was still drooling. Thinking of this, his eyes were very gentle, and his eyes were full of love. When the noble Mr. Tang went downstairs, he gave a lot of instructions to the little helper at home. Even though he had already said it once, he still patiently repeated it this morning before he was relieved. Actually, how could he really be relieved? Xiao Ran was already waiting. She was not going this time. She was only here to pick up the documents. Tangyu gave the documents to her, and then he took the car to the airport. On the private plane, Tangyu was still facing a pile of documents, and he was still not paying attention. Meng Qingcheng came with him. "Are you still thinking about Pei Chi-Chi?" Tangyu glanced at him. "Mrs. Tang." Meng Qingcheng touched his nose. "I'm used to it, but if you're not pregnant, Pei Chi-Chi really looks a little young. Standing next to you, you really feel like you're eating tender grass." "Qingcheng, no one will think you're a mute even if you don't speak." Tangyu flipped open the document and took a sip of the coffee beside him. Meng Qingcheng was sitting opposite him. After thinking about it, he couldn't help but say, "I received news that Xin Lian is also staying at the Hilton Hotel, and," he smiled meaningfully, "she is staying in the CEO's suite next to yours. Tangyu, you can catch up." Tangyu knew about this, but he did not take it seriously. If a man didn't think about other things, just like when Pei Huan ran into his room to take a bath, he didn't seem to be moved at all. He didn't have any physiological feelings either. Therefore, there was no need for Xin Lian to be like this. Tangyu did not respond, and Meng Qingcheng suddenly felt a little bored. He got up and said, "Tangyu, it is difficult to find some gossip and entertainment from you." Chapter 697. Tangyu ignored him and continued to deal with his own business. After a while, he raised his hand to look at his watch and used the satellite phone to call Pei Chi-Chi's number. It was nothing more than some common life knowledge, causing Meng Qingcheng to be stunned. When Tangyu put down the phone, Meng Qingcheng swallowed hard. "Tangyu, your Pei Chi-Chi used to be able to take care of herself, right? Why was it that after marrying Tangyu, Tangyu had to teach her the common knowledge of brushing her teeth every day?" Tangyu put down the phone slowly and glanced at Meng Qingcheng. Then, he said slowly, "Qingcheng, you're not married and you're not going to be a father. You don't understand." Meng Qingcheng couldn't take it anymore. He asked the truth. "Tangyu, you're Pei Chi-Chi's father, right?" Although he was only 6 years older, Tangyu was precocious. He was full of the aura of a mature elite. Perhaps he had a special fatherly love at home. That must be it. Look at him. He kept saying "good girl" and "don't forget this" and "don't forget that." He was just like his mother, spoiling Pei Chi-Chi like a child. Meng Qingqing pounded his chest and stamped his feet. Tang Yu said calmly, Pei Mingyi passed away. I'm Chi-Chi's only relative. Male relative. Meng Qingqing stared at him in a daze for a long time. Then, he asked, then do you roleplay? He couldn't imagine it. Just thinking about it gave him a nosebleed. Tang Yu was such a decent person, but he was also such a pervert. Tang Yu ignored him. How could he reveal too much about the private matters between him and Pei Chi-Chi? Chatting like this for a while diluted some of his feelings of longing. Speaking of which, it was a little funny. He had only been away for 2 hours, but he already missed his little fellow. It was probably the sequelae of being inseparable for a month. At 6:00 in the evening, Paris time, the private plane landed and then took a car to the Hilton Hotel. Originally, Meng Qingqing had booked a room for himself, but Tang Yu stopped him. Qingqing, stay with me. Meng Qingqing looked at him with a very strange expression. After a while, he coughed lightly. Tang Yu, if you have been too abstinent recently, I can help you think of a way. But I can't do it myself. I am a straight man. Tang Yu swiped his card and walked into the presidential suite. He turned around and said, That's what I wanted to tell you. Meng Qingqing touched his nose and followed him in. Actually, he was quite good-looking. This suite covered an area of about 800 square meters. It was divided into a master bedroom, a secondary bedroom, a children's room, a conference room, and a study. It was fully functional. Of course, it was also expensive, more than $30,000 a night. Meng Qingqing put his luggage away and pulled his tie when he walked out. I know, you want me to protect you. Tang Yu glanced at him and did not say anything. He just held the red wine in his hand and took a sip. Meng Qingqing looked at him and teased. It's not easy for a man to come out. A man without a wife by his side should be a bird released from the cage. As soon as he said that, he felt that his analogy was really too appropriate. Tang Yu, a bird released from the cage. This meeting was quite important, otherwise Tang Yu would not have come in person. It was not that he had to do anything special, but out of courtesy, he had to show his face. At the same time, Lei Group and Jean Taihe were also partners, and there would be a dinner party a week later. Tang Yu glanced at him and did not say anything, slowly tasting the wine. Chapter 698. Tang Yu glanced at him and didn't say anything, sipping his wine slowly. As expected, he saw Shun Lian at the meeting the next day, but he just glanced at her and didn't talk to her the whole time. What made Shun Lian want to vomit blood was that the 8 bodyguards were still following her even though she was in France. Those who didn't know better would think that she was being ostentatious. What was even more incomprehensible was that these 8 people could enter the headquarters of Lei as if they were in their own backyard. During the meeting, Shun Lian kept staring at Tang Yu, but the latter was indifferent. Meng Qingqing was watching from the side. As a bystander, it was time for Shun Lian to let it go. Tang Yu and Pei Chi-Chi were married and had a child. Tang Yu spoiled Pei Chi-Chi so much that there probably wouldn't be a day when they would divorce. Shun Lian was rich, beautiful, and had a good figure. There were people chasing after her from City B to France. Why bother? After the meeting, Tang Yu turned down President Lei's invitation and returned to the hotel. He was still blocked by Shun Lian at the door of the suite. Tang Yu, ask them to leave. Shun Lian's voice was a little hoarse. Tang Yu didn't say a word. After a long time, he said slowly, Shun Lian, do you know what these 8 people are for? Shun Lian was stunned. Wasn't it to monitor them? Tang Yu pursed his thin lips. If something happens to Chi-Chi one day, Shun Lian was even more stunned. If something happened to Pei Chi-Chi, would these 8 people immediately deal with her in the same way? No, it's 100 times. Tang Yu didn't have the slightest expression. Shun Lian, that's enough. You've done enough. Then he opened the door and walked into the room, but Shun Lian was still in a daze. She was stunned. So she had been wrong all along. It turned out that those people had such an effect. She had thought too soft-hearted of Tang Yu. But why didn't he say it? Why did he say it now? She turned around and saw the 8 people standing behind her. She felt a chill down her spine. With trembling hands, she took out her mobile phone and typed quickly. She only wrote a few words. Halt all operations. After writing these words, her body was trembling. She believed that as long as she did it, If anything happened to Pei Chi-Chi, Tang Yu would blame it on her. Moreover, he would be 100 times more ruthless. Xun Lian bit her lip, her eyes filled with unwillingness. However, no matter how unwilling she was, she had no chance to get close to Tang Yu. She could only look at him from afar, watching him mature. Even standing in the middle of a group of Europeans, he was still dazzling and dazzling. Xun Lian squinted her eyes and just looked at it. As she looked, her eyes felt a little sore. She drank a lot of alcohol. In the past, he was hers. At that time, they were very close. Everyone said that they were a good match. Tang Yu also said that she was the prettiest girl in the world in a white dress. So many years of love couldn't compare to a few months of Pei Chi-Chi. Was physical contact that important? So important that he fell in love with Pei Chi-Chi so quickly. Xun Lian looked at Tang Yu and drank the red wine in her glass. She wore a white dress today. The front was very conservative, and the back was hollowed out, showing off her beautiful back. All the men present were secretly looking at her. But in her eyes, there was no one else but Tang Yu. She saw his sexy Adam's apple move when he raised his head to drink. She still remembered kissing him there many years ago. At that time, he was still very young and not as mature as he was now. Chapter 699. The nightlife in Paris was very rich, but Tang Yu was not in the mood to miss it. He would return to City B early the next morning, and he was eager to go home. He drank the last mouthful of wine and slowly walked out of the hall. The air outside was a little moist, and it was very beautiful with the night sky. He was not in the mood to appreciate it. He walked to the parking lot, and the driver opened the door for him. When he returned to the top floor of the Hilton Hotel, he was surprised to see Xun Lian. Although the 8 King Kongs were around, it did not stop Xun Lian from showing off her beauty. Xun Lian was obviously drunk. Her hand was on the wall, and her eyes were full of lust as she looked at Tang Yu. In her eyes, besides seduction, there was also provocation. No man could stand this. Not wanting and not daring to want were two different things. Tang Yu looked at Xun Lian quietly, and he opened the door, ready to go in. A slender and soft arm wrapped around him. Xun Lian hugged him from behind and murmured, "Tang Yu, hug me." She was behind him, and her hot face was pressed against his back. Her slender fingers were also moving upwards. "Let go." Tang Yu's voice was calm. "Be more self-conscious, Miss Xun." He called her Miss Xun. Xun Lian chuckled. She tilted her head and looked up at his side profile. "I'm not Miss Xun." "No, Tang Yu, I'm not. I just want to go back to being the original Xun Lian." She was crying. "Tang Yu, let's go back to the past. Let's pretend that nothing happened. Let's be together. There's no one else between us. There's no Qin Anlin, no Pei Chi-Chi." Okay. He did not know how much she missed him and how much she loved him. She was wrong. If she could do it all over again, she would not choose to sleep with Qin Anlin to test him. She would listen to him and be good. Tang Yu firmly broke away from Xun Lian and turned his head. His noble expression did not change at all because of her confession and contact. His gaze was calm. "Xun Lian, it's been so many years. Why bother thinking about it? If you wanted to start over, why didn't you compensate Uncle Xun?" Xun Lian shook her head gently, tears still on her face. She was indeed a woman with the appearance of a lotus. She was especially beautiful when she cried at this moment, giving off a delicate and touching feeling. However, Tang Yu was not moved at all. He only sighed in his heart. Many years ago, Xun Lian used to be beautiful. Or perhaps, he had let her down. He had let her down. He walked in firmly. Xun Lian called his name hoarsely behind him. "Tang Yu, don't you love me anymore?" He had walked out long ago, but she did not. She was still at the same spot, still remembering what he said in the past. "Tang Yu, I want to forget too. I want to give up too. But I can't do it." Xun Lian had never been so humble in front of him before. She was almost begging him. After that, she dropped her gown on the ground. Her fair body was enough to make any man crazy and infatuated. She just stood there like that, not caring if the 8 men saw it or not. She only knew that she only had one chance. Because Tang Yu was at his softest now. If he wanted her, she would have a way to make him marry her. Her tears flowed, and her body glowed under the light. She was indeed beautiful. Tang Yu, look at me. Don't you feel anything? She kicked off her gown and walked toward him slowly. Every step he took was like a fatal temptation. Tang Yu stood there. He was a man, but she might be disappointed. Chapter 700. Finally, Shun Lian approached him. She looked at him and said, Tang Yu, take me. Her voice was weak but alluring. Tang Yu looked at her quietly and said calmly, put on your clothes. His voice sounded a little stern, or perhaps a little disappointed. After all, he and Shun Lian had a relationship when they were young. He didn't want her to become like this. Shun Lian didn't move. She looked at him and sneered, you don't dare to? Or you can't? Or are you afraid that Pei Chi will find out? Tang Yu paused for 2 seconds before he looked at her and said softly, Qingcheng, please ask President Shun to leave. Meng Qingcheng? Shun Lian was stunned. She didn't expect Meng Qingcheng to be in this room. Meng Qingcheng was different from the bodyguards. Although Meng Qingcheng was only Tang Yu's personal assistant, this personal assistant was also a respected person in City B. Shun Lian couldn't lower herself in front of Meng Qingcheng. At the same time, she also knew why Tang Yu wanted to stay in the same room with Meng Qingcheng. It was to guard against her. Shun Lian tilted her head, and her eyes were provocative. Tang Yu, I don't believe that you don't feel anything at all. Her fingers moved downwards, but she didn't succeed. Tang Yu grabbed her hand and said in a deep voice, Shun Lian, save some face for yourself. With that said, he pushed her away. Shun Lian was stunned. He was actually so indifferent. She knew that she was beautiful enough and seductive enough tonight. The perfume she wore tonight was specially made to charm men. But Tang Yu didn't have any feelings for her at all. Seeing her like this, Meng Qingcheng sighed. She picked up Shun Lian's clothes from the ground and handed them to her. She touched her nose and said, the air conditioning is good. Don't catch a cold. Sigh, looking at Shun Lian's figure, I'm going to vomit blood. Even Tang Yu can resist it. Shun Lian hugged her gown, feeling extremely embarrassed. She had really made a big joke out of herself. Just as she was putting on her clothes with trembling hands, Tang Yu came out of the bedroom with his documents in his hand. His voice was a little anxious. Qingcheng, stay here to deal with the aftermath. I need to return to B City immediately. Meng Qingcheng was dumbfounded. Could he have been scared off by Shun Lian? That's impossible. Tang Yu has seen all kinds of storms and waves. While he was dumbfounded, Tang Yu had already left. Meng Qingcheng raised his hand and said, all right, he's gone. CEO Shun can leave now, right? Why don't we have a drink? Shun Lian's answer was to throw a high-heeled shoe at his face. The white shoe slid down Meng Qingcheng's face. Meng Qingcheng was dumbfounded. With such a bad temper, it was no wonder that no man wanted her. Tang Yu didn't want her, and even Qin Anlin didn't want her. Shun Lian chased after him barefoot. When she reached the entrance of the hotel, Tang Yu was opening the car door and getting into the car. Tang Yu. She quickly went over and grabbed his arm. Don't go. She knew that he rushed back to B City for Pei Chi. She wouldn't let him go. She wouldn't let him go. Tang Yu looked at Shun Lian coldly. Let go. He pushed her away roughly, got into the car, closed the door, and started the car quickly. The car drove away like a streamline, and she stood there in tears. She couldn't make him stay, from body to soul. Shun Lian smiled with tears flowing down her face. She smiled softly. Something must have happened to that bitch, Pei Chi. Otherwise, Tang Yu wouldn't have rushed back. In the night of Paris, Shun Lian lost herself. Chapter 701. Tang Yu returned to B City as soon as possible. Late at night, he walked along the corridor of the hospital, his footsteps cold and clear. He pushed open the door to Dr. May's office. Dr. May, her assistant, and even Lin Yun and her husband were all there. Zhao Yi supported his pregnant wife with one hand as he watched Tang Yu enter and helped Lin Yun to sit down. Tang Yu's face showed exhaustion from flying for a long time, but his body was still tense. In fact, he was burning with anger. Dr. May told him over the phone that Chi had found an abnormality in her routine pregnancy test. The sudden decrease in white blood cells in her blood was shocking. Of course, the hospital was afraid of making a mistake. So they drew her blood again, but the result was the same. The data showed that the pregnant Pei Chi-Chi might be suffering from an acute blood disease, the same disease as Tang Xin. However, Pei Chi-Chi was suffering from an acute blood disease. Dr. May's voice was a little low. Tang Yu, we can't rule out the possibility that the pregnancy weakened her immune system, but I suspect that this disease is inherited in the family, so don't blame yourself. Even if she didn't get pregnant this time, the probability of her getting this disease is still very high when she gets pregnant in the future or when her body is weakened. Tang Yu couldn't hear what she was saying. He could only hear the buzzing sound. Lin Yun's heart was also heavy. She never expected Chi-Chi to get sick. At this moment, she thought of Tang Yu's words. Chi-Chi had never been treated fairly since she was born, and now, Lin Yun sighed, she didn't know what to say. Tang Yu looked at Dr. May, his voice dry. Is there any way to treat it? If you want chemotherapy now, you have to give up the child. Although it was cruel, Dr. May had to continue. The child is 6 months old now. If it was 7 months, we could perform a C-section and put it in the incubator for a few months, but it's only 6 months. Dr. May sighed. It was already 6 months. What a pity for the child. Tang Yu couldn't hear anything around him. He kept looking forward. There was a white fog in front of him. At this moment, he was faced with the most difficult choice. After a long time, he said hoarsely, do we have to abort the child? That child was Tang Xion's life and Pei Chi-Chi's life. Dr. May took off her glasses. She was silent for a long time before she said, if we find the bone marrow and Chi-Chi has a strong will to live, we can wait until the child is taken out in 7 months before we operate on Chi-Chi. But the prerequisite is that there must be a suitable bone marrow. Dr. May's attitude was quite obvious. She wanted to protect Sir. But if he did that, the Tang family might not have an heir. Tang Yu wasn't thinking about this. He was more concerned about whether Chi-Chi could lose this child. His answer was no. He couldn't either. In his heart, he vaguely felt the vicissitudes of life. He didn't know if the heavens were playing a joke on them, or if he was playing a joke on himself. He wiped his face. At this moment, he needed to calm down, but he didn't have the time to do so. His Chi-Chi needed him. Late at night, Tang Yu went to see Pei Chi-Chi. He carefully pushed the door open. The moonlight fell on the bed, white and desolate. She was in a deep sleep. One of her hands was placed outside the blanket, resting on her belly. Her other hand was under her head. She was lying on her side. Her belly seemed to have grown a little bigger. Tang Yu slowly sat down. His fingers landed on her long, black hair and slowly combed it. His eyes were glued to her small face. Her features were still as exquisite as a painting, but there was a trace of paleness. Chapter 702. Tang Yu lowered his head and kissed her forehead. Chi-Chi, are you in pain now? As he kissed her like that, Pei Chi-Chi finally woke up in the middle of the night. When she opened her eyes, she saw his deep eyes in the dim light. Her heart skipped a beat and she hugged his neck. Tang Yu, why are you back? He touched her fluffy head and said, how could I stay in France when you're not feeling well? It's nothing, I just threw up. Pei Chi-Chi nestled in his arms and stuck out her tongue. I heard that some people will vomit during the 3rd trimester. That's probably what happened to me. As she said that, she patted her stomach. If you're not obedient, then I'll let your dad hit you, but when you come out next time. Tang Yu smiled, his dark eyes gazing at her fair little face in the dark. Her little face was filled with satisfaction and happiness. Until now, no one had told her the truth. They all thought that it was better for him to tell her about such things. Tang Yu hated this feeling of helplessness. How could he say such a cruel thing to her? How could he ask her to give up her child? He couldn't do it, but he couldn't ignore her life. He knew that even if she gave up the child for chemotherapy, she would still need a bone marrow transplant to save her life. Bone marrow. There were thousands of knots in Tang Yu's heart. At this moment, he couldn't untie a single one of them. And Tang Xian, in Chi-Chi's heart, Tang Xian was as important as the child. He lay on the hospital bed and coaxed her to sleep. When he came back, she was excited to talk to him, but she fell asleep after a few words. And Tang Yu couldn't sleep the whole night looking at her sleeping face. He invited the best specialist, an overseas specialist, and the result was the same as Dr. May's. Pei Chi vomited badly, and she liked to sleep more and more. But she always thought that it was morning sickness. She often touched her stomach and talked to the baby inside. She asked Tang Yu what the baby should be called. Tang Yu asked her to name it. As a result, Pei Chi carefully looked it up in the dictionary. Finally, she ran to him and asked, Tang Yu, I think you should call me Tang Tang. Tang Yu looked at her and slowly said, Then why don't you call me Tangua? His stupid Chi also nodded. That's a good name. Tang Yu was stunned. His mouth seemed to be blocked by something, and it was especially uncomfortable. He didn't say anything. He just reached out and patted Chi-Chi's head. How could he bear to lose such a Chi-Chi? How could he bear to give up the baby in her belly? Under his palm, Pei Chi-Chi was like a docile kitten. After a while, she raised her head and said, Then I'll look again. He just looked at her like that, greedy and longing. 3 days later, Dr. May and Tang Yu met alone in Dr. May's office. Tang Yu stood in front of the window, looking out quietly. Dr. May looked at him for a long time, and neither of them spoke. In the deathly silence, Dr. May faintly asked, Tang Yu, have you decided? Because Chi-Chi's illness was not like Tang Xian's. She couldn't delay it. Tang Yu raised his head, and his Adam's apple bulged. After a while, he turned his head and looked at Dr. May. Aunt May, if it's possible, I don't want to choose. His choice meant, maybe he would lose. He would lose Chi-Chi, lose Tang Xian. Or maybe he wouldn't be able to keep the baby. Chapter 703. Dr. May's eyes were slightly moist. She had been taking care of Chi-Chi. Up until now, Chi-Chi still didn't know that she was sick. She always thought that her vomiting and sleepiness were because of her pregnancy. Just when she thought that there was nothing to talk about today, Tang Yu said, Continue to protect the child. 1 month later, he raised his head and said, Take the child out. Dr. May was shocked. She couldn't help but get up. Tang Yu? Tang Yu didn't explain, but the truth was not far away. Perhaps the truth had always been around. So Shan Zhongshan became demented. Just yesterday, Dr. Yuan had come to see him and placed a DNA report and a bone marrow match report in front of him. Dr. Yuan said with a heavy heart, Mr. Shun's body was originally unable to withstand this kind of surgery, and now, there's no need to mention it. His only hope was Shen Lian. Of course, Tang Yu knew how much he would have to pay. Tang Yu just smiled and got up. Aunt May, please don't tell Chi-Chi. No one was allowed to tell her. He would rather she hate him, but he wanted her to live. He also wanted the child to live. He also wanted to be with her again one day, even if he had to wait for the rest of his life, even if she hated him to the core. He also wanted her to live a good life. Dr. May was stunned. She also realized that Tang Yu might have made a terrible decision. She opened her mouth and wanted to say something, but in the end, she was disappointed. She couldn't convince Tang Yu, nor could she convince him. This child would never change his mind once he made up his mind. Tang Yu looked at Dr. May quietly and smiled faintly. I can't live without Chi-Chi. But at the same time, he gave up on Tang Xian. Tang Yu pushed the door open and went out. Shun Lian was standing at the door. She was holding a document in her hand. She waved the document in her hand and looked at him. Tang Yu, can we have a cup of coffee now? Tang Yu's gaze was deep. Half an hour later, he sat with her in the corner of a cafe. Shin Lian pushed the file in her hand to Tang Yu and smiled. Before we talk, you can take a look at this. Tang Yu's brows furrowed slightly. His gaze landed on it, and he reached out to take it. However, Shun Lian tightened her grip and raised her chin slightly. Tang Yu, have you thought it through? It's like Pandora's box. Once you open it, you can't take it back. She placed her hand on the back of his hand. Tang Yu's hand was slender and had a beautiful jade color. Shun Lian was a little dazed as she looked at it. Tang Yu exerted some force with his fingers and took the document. He was extremely calm. Only he knew the fluctuations in his heart. At this moment, his heart was trembling. There were 2 bone marrow matches, one for Shen Lian and the other for Tang Xian. Shen Lian and Pei Chi were actually compatible. When his gaze landed on it, Shun Lian chuckled and said, Tang Yu, are the heavens helping me? Tang Yu was still quiet. He looked at it for a long time and finally shifted his gaze back to Shen Lian. What do you want? Shen Lian supported her chin with her fingers and drew circles on the table with her other hand. What if I want you to kneel down and beg me? Tang Yu's gaze tensed and she giggled. Of course I won't do that. Tang Yu, why would I want you to kneel down? I'm not humiliating you. I'm humiliating myself. He did not say a word and just looked at her. Chapter 704. Tang Yu narrowed his eyes and stared at Shen Lian. Of course, you don't have to do that. I can even save Tang Xian, your precious sister, for free. Shen Lian laughed coldly. She's my precious sister too, isn't she? Tang Yu's Adam's apple bobbed uncontrollably. The person in front of him was no longer Shen Lian. She was no longer the innocent young girl from before. She was the devil. Tang Yu, you can choose between your precious sister and Tang Xian. If it's me, I'll choose Tang Xian. If my sister dies, I can still marry my younger sister. Shen Lian leaned forward. Isn't that perfect? Suddenly, her arm was caught. He used all his strength. She was in pain, but Shen Lian was happy. She finally saw Tang Yu in a dilemma. She saw that he was no longer so indifferent when facing her. The veins on Tang Yu's forehead almost popped out. He narrowed his eyes and looked at Shen Lian. His thin lips were pressed into a straight line. Is it difficult? Shen Lian laughed softly. Now, let's count down. 5, 4, 3, 2. Tang Yu's fingers loosened. A victorious smile appeared on Shen Lian's face. But there was a hint of bitterness in it. In the end, he was willing to do anything for Pei Chi-Chi. In the end, it was still for that bitch. I can save her, divorce her, and let her attend our engagement ceremony. Shen Lian smiled, but there was no smile in her eyes. She finally got everything she wanted. The company, Tang Yu, but in the face of victory, she was happy, but her heart was empty. Tang Yu slowly leaned back in his chair. He looked at Shen Lian calmly. He was so calm that she was a little scared. She thought he wouldn't agree, but Tang Yu said, I'll handle everything between us. You're not allowed to disturb or hurt her. Shen Lian was a little annoyed. Tang Yu, do you think you still have any conditions to negotiate with me? If you don't agree, we can stop talking. His gaze was firm and calm, his expression impeccable. Shen Lian tried to find a flaw in his eyes, but there was nothing. In terms of determination, she would never be a match for Tang Yu. Even if they were talking about the life and death of his sweetheart, it would still be the same. She gritted her teeth. All right. There was no fluctuation in Tang Yu's eyes. Our engagement was after Pei Chi-Chi had her bone marrow changed. Shen Lian sneered, You won't deny it when the time comes, right? Tang Yu didn't say anything. Shen Lian felt that she had asked a stupid question, but she soon cheered up. Tang Yu, for the sake of fairness, I think you have to do something to make me believe in your sincerity. As she said that, she took out a document from her bag. I think this is a mutual guarantee for us, right? Tang Yu stared at the document and then looked up at Shen Lian. There was a trace of malice in his eyes. If you don't sign it, you can only say sorry. Your Pei Chi-Chi, your baby sister, your child? Oh yes, I forgot. No matter what, that child can't be born. What a pity. Shen Lian chuckled and blew at him. Tang Yu closed his eyes, then took out a cigarette, lit it, and slowly took a few puffs. I'll sign it before the operation. He looked at her. Shen Lian, are you happy to do this? Shen Lian was stunned. Tang Yu got up and walked out. And Xiaoxin, is it the same name as Tang Xian? Chi-Chi stretched her little head and looked at him eagerly. Tang Yu patted her little head and smiled faintly. He didn't say anything. They returned to the rose garden. She still vomited occasionally. Tang Yu asked her to take a lot of medicine every day. She was worried that it would affect the child, so she refused to take it. He said that it was not affected by the medicine prescribed by Dr. May. Pregnancy was very painful and uncomfortable, but when she thought of the little baby in her belly, she felt that it was nothing. Chapter 706. Every night, he would put her on the ivory-colored bed and kiss her tenderly. He carefully worshipped and kissed every inch of her body. Pei-Chi-Chi didn't know why he was torturing himself like this. He couldn't do it, but he insisted on doing it every day. The storm started half a month later. An entertainment reporter dug up Zhao Ke's story, and Pei-Chi-Chi's identity was exposed. The fact that she was Zhao Ke's daughter was publicized in the media, and the Lin and Tang families were under great pressure. Pei-Chi-Chi naturally saw it. She looked at it for a while and didn't say a word. After a long time, she looked at Tang Yu. Why did someone write this all of a sudden? Do you care? Tang Yu looked at her and smiled. Our Chi-Chi should be very calm now. Pei-Chi-Chi lowered her eyes. Pei Huan called me yesterday and said that she wanted to go back to the Pei group. I didn't agree, but she said that she had important evidence. If I didn't agree, she would ruin your reputation. She couldn't understand. Did the Pei group have anything to do with Tang Yu's reputation? She wanted to meet Pei Huan, but Tang Yu might not agree. To her surprise, Tang Yu agreed and nodded. It's good to meet her. Ask her to come in the afternoon, and I'll meet her too. Pei-Chi-Chi looked at Tang Yu and didn't say a word for a long time. She had been with him for a long time, and he seemed to be the same as before. However, she was his wife, and she could still feel the slight difference in him. Tang Yu was hiding something from her. He got up and kissed her. I'll go upstairs to deal with some business. Pei-Chi-Chi nodded and watched him go upstairs. Tang Yu paused for a moment and walked to the stairs. When he reached the middle of the stairs, he turned his head and looked at her. Pei-Chi-Chi also looked up at him. Something was different. They were still in love, and they were still living together. She seemed to be very happy, but she was already beginning to feel uneasy. Tang Yu smiled faintly. This was the last smile he would give her. He slowly went upstairs and walked to the end of the corridor on the second floor. He took out a cigarette and lit it slowly, but he did not smoke. He let the cigarette burn out in his hand. When the red dot finally burned out, he suddenly turned around and looked at Pei-Chi-Chi, who was a few meters away. She guessed it, Tang Yu's eyes were slightly moist. He looked at Pei-Chi-Chi and watched her stand there. She was wearing a set of white floral home clothes. She was still skinny, but her belly was bulging. She looked like a cute frog. Tang Yu's fingers were trembling as he held the cigarette butt. Slowly, he finally approached her. Standing a few steps away from her, he said softly, Chi-Chi, we can't be together. Her pupils dilated as she stared at him. The speculation on the internet is true. You are not Pei Mingyi's child. He looked at her as if she was a helpless little animal. His heart tightened and almost broke. The person he did not want to hurt the most was Pei-Chi-Chi, but he was hurting her at this moment. He even wanted to end her love for him with his own hands. He knew that it was very difficult, but he forced himself to do it. Because of this, his Chi-Chi could survive. He chose Chi-Chi and gave up Tang Xian. It was already a sin. Pei-Chi-Chi looked at him and could not say a word for a long time. Chapter 707. Tang Yu looked at her, frowning, and said quietly, Chi-Chi, we are brother and sister. She looked at him, and her whole body was cold. What was Tang Yu talking about? They were brother and sister? How could they be brother and sister? Her lips moved, trying to force a smile, but she couldn't, because his face was calm and without a ripple. No, you can't be Zhao Kexing's. Pei-Chi-Chi murmured. She looked at him, hoping that he would tell her that everything was just a joke. Tang Yu looked at her quietly. Chi-Chi, you are Tang Ziyuan's child, just like me. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't believe what he said. There is a paternity test in my study. His eyes were deep. I just got it a week ago. Chi-Chi. A week ago? Pei-Chi-Chi's lips trembled, and she stepped back. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to believe that it was true. She kept retreating until she reached the wall and had nowhere else to go. She leaned against the wall, and her head was against the cold wall. She looked at him hopelessly, like a desperate little beast. They were brother and sister. What about their marriage? What about their child? Did they not want it anymore? She looked at him anxiously, but Tang Yu was still calm. He was so calm that it scared her. It was as if he had already decided. Her lips moved, and she asked with difficulty, "What are you going to do with my child?" He didn't speak, and just looked at her. After a long time, he went to the study and put a file in her hand. His voice was still as gentle as before, but it was different. She heard him say, "Chi-Chi, this child can't be kept." Can't be kept? Really? Her tears fell, and her eyes finally fell on the file. She opened it gently. She read it anxiously. After reading it, she clenched the papers tightly. She was Tang Ziyuan's daughter. "I don't believe it," Pei Chi-Chi suddenly said harshly. Her fingers tore the paper into pieces, as if she could tear apart all reality. How could she be Tang Yu's sister? So all this time, she had been having sex with her brother? How could such a ridiculous thing happen? "Tang Yu, I don't believe it. I don't believe a word of it." She covered her head, unwilling to accept such a reality. Tang Yu stood there with his hands clenched into fists. He really wanted to hug her and tell her that this wasn't real, but he couldn't do that. If she knew the truth, she would rather die than accept Shun Lian's bone marrow. He could only make her hate him. "Chi-Chi, this is the reality that we have no choice but to accept." He finally stepped forward and held her shoulders. However, Pei Chi-Chi pushed him away with one hand. There was a guarded look in her eyes, as if she was an injured animal. She closed her eyes and held the wall with her fingers to stand still. After a long time, she opened her eyes and looked at Tang Yu. She asked him softly, "Do you not want our baby anymore?" Tang Yu saw the heartache in her eyes, but he was in 100 times more pain than she was. He didn't answer, but Pei Chi-Chi found the answer in his eyes. "You don't even want me anymore, do you?" Her voice was soft, and it sounded like a storm was brewing. Tang Yu said quietly, "Chi-Chi, you can't have this child." She was crying and her body was pressed against the wall. This was the only way she could stand and talk to him. Chapter 708. You can't? "Tang Yu, I'm your sister? Then you hug and kiss your sister every day. Don't you feel guilty?" She almost roared at the end. He closed his eyes. "Chi-Chi, I love you." "Love?" She looked at him in a daze. "Then let's continue to be together. I'll give birth to this child, okay?" He looked at her with a heartache. Pei Chi-Chi held onto her abdomen and supported herself as she slowly walked over. They stood face to face. It had only been 5 minutes, but her world had been turned upside down. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. She used the most humble posture in her life. "Tang Yu, please, let me give birth to this child, okay?" She pulled his hand and placed it on her stomach. "She's our child. You said you love her, didn't you?" Her empty eyes searched his face anxiously, trying to find traces of him softening. But there was none. He only pulled her into his arms and closed his eyes in pain. "Chi-Chi, be rational." Her entire body stiffened. He called her rational. Slowly, slowly, she left his arms. She looked at him, her eyes full of unfamiliarity. "Is your love rational?" She asked him softly and took 2 steps back. She instinctively hugged her stomach and stared at him. "Tang Yu, do you still want me?" She was almost forcing him to make a decision. Her slender and fragile body was trembling. She could barely stand with her hand on her stomach, but she still stood there stubbornly, waiting for his answer. Tang Yu's thin lips were tightly pursed, and the muscles on his face were trembling violently. Even though he had built it countless times, he still couldn't say it in front of her. "Tang Yu, is it hard to answer?" She wiped away the tears on her face and said hoarsely, "The love you talked about, is it all gone? Because I'm your sister?" There was a crazed look on her face. There was a flickering flame, like a burning fire, like the brightest shooting star in the universe. "I don't care." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face again. "Tang Yu, I don't care. I don't care if I'm your little sister. I don't care if I'm Tang Ziyuan's daughter. As long as I'm with you, do you hear me?" She raised her head and roared at him, trying her best not to cry, trying her best to be strong. Yes, so what if they are brother and sister? She wanted to be with him. He had said that no matter what, he would not let go of her hand. Tang Yu felt as if a knife was being twisted in his heart. His Chi-Chi. His Chi-Chi had once left him and avoided him because she was Zhao Ke's daughter. Because she hid her love deeply, giving it once was her everything. At this moment, she was like a moth flying into a flame, desperately wanting to be with him. But he could not. If she was his sister, he didn't care. However, only her life would not allow him to get close to her again. She was in pain, and he was in even more pain. His fingers clenched into fists. He watched her cry in pain, watched her tear her heart out. Chapter 709. The sun rose slowly, lighting up the long hallway, leaving a shadow on her face and his. Deeply, deeply engraved their faces in each other's hearts. She looked at him with a strange look in her eyes. She begged him, but it was useless. Softly, she asked him with tears in her eyes, "If you don't want children, you want to divorce me, right?" He said he couldn't have such a scandal. He couldn't announce to the public that he had an affair with his sister, got married and had children. He said he had the lifelines of both the Lin and Tang families behind him. He said he could only give up on her and sacrifice her. Then what about her love? What about the love he spoke of? What about their children? Were they all going to be sacrificed? Sacrificed, gone. Her eyes were filled with white. She couldn't see anything. She couldn't see him. Tang Yu sat in front of the bed and looked at Pei Chi-Chi. She had fainted. There was pain in his eyes as his slender fingers fell on her cold face. Chi-Chi, it hurts, right? I'm in pain too, but I can't wait to do this. He closed his eyes and walked to the study room. He opened another secret compartment and moved the entire wall. Inside, there was a medical room. It took up a lot of space, about 100 square meters, with all kinds of medical equipment. Dr. May stood there, looking at Tang Yu and sighing. "Tang Yu, have you thought it through? You might never get her forgiveness for what you did." Tang Yu walked to a small crib and slowly stroked it with his fingers. Maybe his child didn't need this for the time being and could only stay in the incubator. Maybe he couldn't accompany the premature baby for the time being. He stroked it carefully and looked at it for a long time on behalf of Pei Chi-Chi. The crib was pink, a little out of place in this plain white space, but it was the last warm color in his heart. There would be a long time in the future when his world would only be gray and black. Dr. May waited for a long time before Tang Yu said softly, "I can wait." These 3 words exhausted all of Tang Yu's feelings. He could wait. His love could be patience. It could be endless waiting. For a long time, she hated him, until she returned to his side. Dr. May felt a lump in her throat. Tang Yu's decision made things difficult for himself and many others. Other than Lin Yun and her husband, she was the only one who knew the truth. Even Tang Ziyuan didn't know much about it. "Ani Mei, she's asleep," Tang Yu said softly. Then, he raised his head, and hot tears slid down the corners of his eyes. He couldn't control them. "Chi-Chi, I'll wait for you here. You remember to go home. Remember what I said. No matter when, I only have you." Tang Yu belonged to Pei Chi-Chi. He belonged to her, not any other woman. When Pei Chi-Chi woke up, it was already afternoon. She heard Pei Huan's voice, Pei Huan's piercing voice. Chapter 710. She looked at it jealously, but soon she became excited. Pei Chi-Chi would be kicked out of the house soon. The Tang and Lin families would never tolerate such a scandal of sibling love. She really wanted to see Pei Chi-Chi look like a stray dog. Tang Yu sat opposite her and said calmly, "Miss Pei, are you here for the Pei Corporation?" Before Pei Huan could speak, Tang Yu continued, "There is a contract here. You can take a look." Pei Huan took it and looked at it. She didn't understand it, so she handed it to the lawyer next to her. The lawyer only read a few lines and looked up at Tang Yu in surprise. What a strange contract. It said that Sheng Yuan would take over the management of the Pei Corporation, and 100% of the Pei Corporation's profits would go to Pei Huan. This was a business that was guaranteed to be profitable. The lawyer whispered to Pei Huan. Pei Huan stared at Tang Yu and said, "Why are you doing this? Is this for Pei Chi-Chi?" And can you guarantee that Pei Chi will hand over the shares? That's not what you should be concerned about, Pei Huan. If you are willing to sign it, then sign it. If not, I won't force you. Tang Yu said coldly. Pei Huan chuckled like a sly fox and said, what if this can't satisfy my appetite? Then Miss Pei, you can sue me. I think my legal team is enough to make you get nothing. Tang Yu had already stood up. If Pei Huan wasn't a pawn in his plan, he wouldn't have the patience to deal with her. Pei Huan narrowed her eyes, and her skin that had been injected with hyaluronic acid trembled abnormally. After a long time, she suddenly exclaimed, did you release that news? Her eyes widened, and she stared at Tang Yu in disbelief. If Tang Yu did it on purpose, then he wanted to divorce Pei Chi? Why did he do that? Pei Huan didn't know why she was like this. For Pei Chi, she actually felt sad for Pei Chi. She hated Pei Chi the most. No, Tang Yu loved Pei Chi very much. How could such a man betray Pei Chi? Tang Yu's voice was as cold as ever. This is not something you can ask. The more he didn't explain, the more suspicious Pei Huan became. Pei Huan, if you want to get the Pei family, then don't ask too much. It won't do you any good. The answer in Pei Huan's heart was about to come out. She looked at Tang Yu and her lips moved. In the end, she still said softly, I agree. She told herself that betraying Pei Chi was actually not a big deal. Their relationship was not good to begin with. There had always been enmity between them. Yes, it's nothing. Pei Huan tried her best to convince herself, but when she finished signing and went out, her legs went soft. She turned her head and looked at the magnificent fantasy castle. This was the castle that Tang Yu had built for Pei Chi. Pei Chi was even pregnant. Was she going to be kicked out by Tang Yu just like that? Pei Huan lowered her eyes and whispered, Cinderella's story is just a fairy tale. Chapter 7:11. She stood on the stairs and looked at Tang Yu. Her voice was cold. Tang Yu, what if I don't sign it? She was talking about the divorce agreement. Tang Yu turned sideways and raised his head to look at her standing on the stairs. Her fingers were clenched tightly against the handrail. He said softly, in a few days, Dad will come to pick you up after the operation. Dad? Was it Tang Ziyuan? Pei Chi-Chi's eyes widened. She stared at Tang Yu. Also, he said the operation? Was he going to abort her child? Pei Chi-Chi bit her lips so hard that they bled. She stared at him. I won't abort this child. Tang Yu looked at her and said in a low voice, reality will not allow this child to be born. He forced himself to be cruel to her and forced himself to be emotionless. Her face was pale. After a while, she smiled softly. She smiled and cried. In just one day, she felt that she had cried all the tears of her life. Tang Yu, that's good. She smiled while crying. She looked at him. I'll sign it, but the child is mine. Her fingers tightly covered her lower abdomen, for fear that he would take away her child. She looked at him as if she was looking at a chopper. Her eyes were slowly filled with pain, and her hands were clenched tightly. A wisp of blood stained the hem of her dress. Pei Chi-Chi lowered her head and took a look. Her eyes were red. Her eyes were a little dazed. She looked at Tang Yu's shocked expression. At this time, there was only his shocked expression left in her world. His expression was magnified, and then pain. A faint smile appeared on her pretty little face. Tang Yu, the child is going to be gone because she knows that you don't want her anymore. Don't want her, don't want me. Darkness, falling. In the dizziness, there was a kind of heart-wrenching pain, as if there was a force pulling the child out of her body. Pain, coma, mixed with their past. Tang Yu, our child will be called Tang Tang? Pei Chi-Chi, wouldn't it be better to just call her Tangua? Tang Yu, do you not like girls? Why would I? I want her to be like you. Chi-Chi, no matter how many children I have, the one I like the most is the oldest one. I'm not a baby. No? Then why did you call me daddy last night? Huh? Pain. The past kept replaying in her mind, refusing to let her go. It turned into Shen Yin's cries of pain, her unwillingness, and her hatred towards him. Amidst her heart-wrenching screams, a weak baby cry rang out. It was very weak, almost non-existent, but he still heard it. Tang Yu stood outside and raised his head. There were tears in his eyes. It was their child. Dr. Mei walked out and patted his shoulder. We need to move Chi-Chi to Shengyuan Hospital immediately. Everything is ready. Tang Yu walked in and trembled as he looked at the girl he loved lying there with a pale face. Her lower abdomen was flat. He reached out and gently touched her little face. A drop of hot tears fell on her porcelain white face. After a long time, his eyes fell on the little green and white thing in the incubator. The child, who was not even a month old, was wrinkled. One of her little hands was waving, and the other hand was clenched into a fist. Her brows were furrowed, as if she was unhappy about being disturbed. Tang Yu overlapped his hand with the little girl's through the glass. He smiled and said, "Hi, baby." The next day, Lin Yun flew to the United States to recuperate. Zhao Yi accompanied her. Chapter 712. When Pei Chi-Chi woke up, her surroundings were white, and the air was filled with the smell of disinfectant. She was in a daze and didn't want to wake up, but she had a feeling that she didn't have a baby in her belly. She slept for 1 day, 2 days, 2 weeks. It was painful. She could feel the nurses walking back and forth around her. She could feel countless needles pricking her body. She could feel Tang Yu beside her, but she didn't want him. The baby was gone. They were over. It was a month later when Pei Chi-Chi really woke up. She had lost a lot of weight. She opened her eyes. Her surroundings were white. In the quiet ward, a nurse was changing her drip. She opened her eyes. When she was a little more clear-headed, she slowly put her fingers on her lower abdomen. There was nothing there. There was nothing there. She didn't make a sound. She just put her hand there and slowly touched it. She didn't make a sound, but her face was already covered with tears. The blood that afternoon seemed to be engraved in her heart, bones, and blood. After a long time, she asked in a hoarse voice, "Where is Mr. Tang?" The nurse was shocked. "Mrs. Tang woke up? Mrs. Tang?" The nurse stammered, "I'll call him right away." Pei Chi-Chi pursed her lips. "Don't call me Mrs. Tang. Soon, I won't be." The nurse was a little embarrassed. She wanted to say something, but she didn't say the last sentence. There were only 3 people in this VIP ward, and each of them had signed a confidentiality agreement. She wanted to say something but stopped. Finally, after the examination, she went outside to call Tang Yu. Tang Yu came in. Before he walked to Pei Chi-Chi, she had already said with a faint and hoarse voice, "It's so strange. You appeared so quickly, Mr. Tang." Tang Yu's lips moved. Finally, he closed his eyes. "Chi-Chi, you were in a coma for a month? Really? Then please take care of me for a month, Mr. Tang." "Thank you." Her eyes were fixed on the ceiling, dull and empty. Her voice was soft. "What about the agreement?" Tang Yu was stunned. He immediately understood what she was talking about. His heart felt like it was being twisted by a knife. She was in a coma for a month, and he kept her for a month. In the end, he couldn't keep her. Right now, she hated him to the core. "Chi-Chi, I won't regret it, even if you hate me for the rest of your life." His voice was extremely dry. "There's no need to be in such a hurry. Mr. Tang, I'm very anxious." Her gaze finally landed on his face. There was a sense of unfamiliarity and coldness in her eyes. This was the first time he had seen Pei Chi-Chi, an insecure Pei Chi-Chi. He had once melted her with his love, but now he was using his cruelty to force her back to the Pei Chi-Chi of the past. "I don't want to, and I don't dare to have anything to do with Mr. Tang." Her lips were so pale that they were almost transparent. She looked at him and smiled softly. Her smile was bitter, and it was like a knife stabbing deep into his heart. She looked at him with disappointment and pain in her eyes, and he was even more so. His lips moved slightly. He wanted to say something, but he couldn't say a word. Their child was not out of danger yet, so he couldn't tell her the truth. In addition, the contract he signed with Shun Lian also made him under the control of others. If Tang Yu was alone, he could risk his life. But he wasn't. He had too many burdens behind him. So even if she had an operation, He could only bury all of it in his heart. In the end, he could only let go. He could only let go of her. But Chi-Chi, one day, you will come back to me. Chapter 7:13. Pei Chi-Chi looked at him with sadness in her eyes. She looked like an injured animal. Tang Yu, I never thought that this day would come. We would end up like this. Go out. I'm a little tired. Pei Chi-Chi suddenly closed her eyes. Her fingers gently touched her lower abdomen, as if the child was still there. His eyes fell on her fingers, and his gaze froze. He looked at her pale and delicate face with greed, knowing that she had made up her mind. He remembered that day when she said to him like a madwoman, Tang Yu, even if we are siblings, I want to be with you. He was shocked. Tang Yu had always thought that Chi-Chi was a reserved person, but he never thought that she loved him so much. But how much she loved him was how much she hated him at this moment. He stood there while she closed her eyes. She didn't want to look at him anymore. Even a glance was unnecessary. Tang Yu smiled dryly and didn't say anything. He walked out and just closed the door. He was punched in the face. The person in front of him was Meng Qingqing. Meng Qingqing's face was a little pale. He stared at Tang Yu's face and said coldly, Tang Yu, you're really a good brother. Tang Yu's body fell on the wall. He had lost a lot of weight in just a month. His expression was colder than before. He reached out and slowly wiped the blood off the corner of his mouth. He looked at Meng Qingqing. Meng Qingqing's face was especially ugly. His voice was a little low and hoarse. Let's talk outside. The two of them went to the rooftop. The wind on the rooftop was very strong. The autumn sun was weak. They stood face to face. Meng Qingqing looked at Tang Yu coldly. In your heart, 1 year of love is worth more than 10 years of sibling love between you and Tang Xian, right? Did Shen Lian tell you that? Meng Qingsheng was still smiling coldly. What did she tell me? She told me that Pei Chi-Chi also has a blood disease. She told me that Shen Zhongshan is Tang Xian and Pei Chi-Chi's father. She told me that you could only save one, and you chose Pei Chi-Chi. Is that right? Tang Yu looked at Meng Qingsheng and held his breath. Tang Xian's disease is acting up again. Of course you don't know, because you only have your Pei Chi-Chi in your heart. Meng Qingsheng looked straight at Tang Yu. Tang Yu, don't you feel any guilt at all? Tang Yu chuckled softly. He turned around and looked into the distance. After a long time, his voice sounded faintly, Qingsheng, I'm already prepared to go to hell. No, I'm already in hell. It was not just him. If anything happened to Tang Xian, Chi-Chi would hate him even more in the future. The child that was just born could not save Tang Xian. His sister, the sister that he watched grow up, was abandoned by him. For the past month, whenever he saw Tang Xian's smiling face, his heart would be filled with sin. He remembered that when she was very young, she called him Big Brother in a very soft and timid voice. When he was young, he was determined to hate this child. But when he looked at her round and smiling face, he could not bring himself to hate her. Later, he found out that her name was Tang Xian. She tried to please him. Big Brother, you can call me Xiaoxin. Her little face was bright and beautiful, like a baby's face in May. Meng Qingqing's eyes were red. His voice was hoarse. Tang Yu, she might not live for long. If Pei Chi-Chi did not appear in Tang Xian's life, she might live to 20 years old. But she was only 17 years old. The disease came so suddenly and suddenly. Chapter 7:14. Tang Yu raised his head. Qingsheng, I've let her down. He turned back to look at Meng Qingqing. He did not explain, nor could he explain. If he had to do it all over again, he would still make the same choice. Meng Qingqing closed his eyes on the rooftop of the hospital. The two men, who were equally tall and strong, looked at each other for a long time. Meng Qingqing then said softly, Tang Yu, from now on, I'm no longer your personal assistant. I'll take care of her until she leaves. Tang Yu was stunned. And you're no longer her brother. I'll give her what you can't give her. Meng Qingqing's eyes were hot, and his voice was a little choked. Tang Xian doesn't want to see such a bastard brother either. Tang Yu did not speak. When he saw Tang Xian, it was already 3 days later. Tang Xian was in a coma in the ICU for the past 3 days. Other than the disease in her blood, Tang Xian had also triggered other diseases. She was lying on the hospital bed weakly, breathing through her nose. Her body was full of tubes, and the back of her hand was swollen because of the drip. Tang Yu walked over slowly and touched the back of her hand. Tang Xian was so young, but she had suffered so much. Brother. Tang Xian suddenly woke up. She opened her eyes and looked at his face under the dim yellow light. Tang Yu smiled faintly. Tang Xian smiled too. Her little hand touched him, and her voice was soft and faint. Brother, you look the best when you smile. She looked pale, and her facial features were not as vivid as before. Her fair skin covered the bones of her hand, and she was very thin. Her lips moved slightly. It was so soft that Tang Yu could not hear it. She kept moving. Tang Yu leaned over and put his ear next to her lips. Tang Xian's lips curled into a faint smile. That smile was like a blooming flower of a young girl, delicate and charming. An extremely weak voice came out of her lips. Big brother, after I die, give me the book that Lin Jinrong gave me. Can I take it with me? Tears welled up in Tang Yu's eyes. Tang Xian looked at him anxiously, hoping that he would agree. Tang Yu closed his eyes and nodded. All right. Dr. Yuan had talked to him about Tang Xian's illness, but there was nothing he could do. He nodded and agreed. Tang Xian's face broke into a faint smile. Her pupils were more unfocused than usual. She stared at Tang Yu for a long time before speaking softly. Chi-Chi, child. Tang Yu's fingers tightened. He held Tang Xian's hand tightly and placed it in his embrace. She's cold, so she can warm up a little. Tang Xian was not afraid. Her brother was here. If you're cold, I can hug you. Her bones were bone-piercingly cold, and it also froze his heart. A faint smile appeared on her face. She could barely make a sound, and could only use her lips to say, Big brother, can you hug Tang Xian? She liked her brother, but she did not dare to get close to him when she was young. Now that she had grown up, time was so short, so short. She still wanted to be hugged by her brother, to hear him call her Tang Xian, and to hear him tell her a story. Tang Yu slowly bent over and hugged her carefully. Tang Xian's lips moved, but it was difficult for her to speak. Brother, pull out these tubes. Tang Xian, don't. Her eyes were much paler, and her face was pale with a tinge of green. There was almost no sign of human. Chapter 7:15. He hugged her, and his body was extremely stiff. He did not move at all. After a long time, he held her with one hand and slowly pulled out the tubes with the other. His Tang Xian said that it was painful and that she did not want these things. His sister said that she wanted him to hug her. Tang Xian, brother will carry you home. He pulled out the tubes for her and carefully helped her put on her clothes. Her previous clothes were empty and her body was so dry that she did not look like a human anymore. In his embrace, she tugged at him with her little hands. Chi-Chi, the baby is still here. Tang Yu closed his eyes and put his face close to Tang Xian's. Her name is Tang Tang, and her nickname is Xiaoxin. Tang Xian, you said that the three of us will be together forever. I'm sorry. Tang Xian's little face was blank for a moment. Tang Tang, Xiaoxin. She lived with her brother and Chi-Chi. Her little hand tugged at his sleeve, and her eyes stared straight at Tang Yu. In fact, she knew that Chi-Chi was sick. It was Shun Lian's sister who told her. She told her that her brother chose to save Chi-Chi. She did not blame her brother because he loved Chi-Chi so much. Tang Xian's lips curled into a faint smile. Her smile was filled with happiness. No one knew that her illness acted up prematurely because she stopped taking her medicine. She did not want Chi-Chi to worry about her. Chi-Chi could not have another child. She vaguely thought that she had lived a happy life for more than 10 years, but Chi-Chi did not. She loved her brother, but she loved Chi-Chi even more. She was willing to do whatever Chi-Chi was willing to do for her. Only when she died, Chi-Chi would not be sad and take the risk of giving birth again. Brother. She loosened her little hand and immediately tightened it. She looked at him. Don't tell. She did not say the last two words, but Tang Yu could guess it. He carried her to the car, and the 4 black cars slowly drove away. Tang Ziyuan was also there. He quietly followed them. Even now, he could already guess, but he didn't say it. Just let Tang Xian be his daughter. Tang Xian returned to Yanhui, where she was born and raised. In the fairy tale-like princess room that Tang Ziyuan had decorated for her, she lay quietly, wearing a beautiful dress that the little maid had changed into. Her little face was ashen, and her breathing was a little hurried. Tang Yu had been sitting beside her, accompanying her, and so had Tang Ziyuan. Her little hand held Tang Yu's finger, and her other hand held Tang Ziyuan's. Her eyes slowly closed. Daddy, brother, don't cry. I'm not in pain, not at all. I was very happy. If possible, I really wanted to see Chi-Chi and Xiaoxin. She must be a very cute baby. Xiaoxin, you have to live happily for me. Tang Xian smiled, but she could no longer open her eyes. An original document was placed on her chest. It was a gift from Lin Jinro. That was the love of the 17-year-old Tang Xian. However, she had failed someone in the end. She knew that brother Qingqing had always liked her, but she could not respond to him, not at all. She could not live for long. She did not want him to remember her. Tang Xian slowly closed her eyes. Forever. On the day she left, there was a flock of white pigeons on the top floor of Shengyuan Hospital. They kept circling above the rooftop, refusing to leave. On the grass field downstairs, Shin Chongshan was pushed outside by Mrs. Shun to bask in the sun. Chapter 7:16. Mrs. Shin looked up and said softly, I don't know where the pigeons came from. She seemed to be deep in thought. Pei Chi-Chi stood in front of the window and saw the pigeons. The sound they made sounded like they were crying blood. She stood straight and looked a little thin. The nurse came in and reminded her softly, Mrs. Tang, put on more clothes. I told you, I'm not. Pei Chi-Chi's voice was a little low. I've signed the papers with Tang Yu. He was not there on the day of the signing. She quickly signed the papers and gave them to the lawyer he sent. There was no need to see him again. She turned around and looked at the nurse. I just had a miscarriage. I don't need to stay here for so long, right? I want to be discharged. The nurse was a little embarrassed. You need Dr. May's permission before you can leave. Pei Chi-Chi put her finger on her abdomen, where there was a scar. Dr. May said that the baby didn't fall out and was cut out. She asked Tang Yu about the baby. The baby didn't come out safely. Couldn't they make a longevity tablet for him? She could find her mother if she wanted to. She remembered that he said that the baby shouldn't exist. Yes, it shouldn't exist, just like she shouldn't exist in his world. I want to go for a walk. Pei Chi-Chi's voice was very soft. The nurse hesitated and said softly, then I'll go with you. Pei Chi-Chi smiled silently. She didn't expect that she was still so precious. Should she thank her brother? She hadn't walked for more than a month. Her body was so weak that it didn't feel like her own. She was sweating all over after walking for a while. The autumn sun shone on the lawn of the hospital. It was very bright and beautiful. Occasionally, there were some pigeons on the lawn looking for bugs to eat. When Pei Chi-Chi walked over, they flew away. She stopped and looked at Shin Zhongshan and Mrs. Shun in front of her. Shin Zhongshan was still the same as before. He was still eating and asking for more. Pei Chi-Chi looked at him and suddenly felt that he was actually very happy like this. She pursed her lips and looked at it silently for a long time. A greedy white pigeon probably took a fancy to the food in Shin Zhongshan's hand. It flew down and landed on Shin Zhongshan's shoulder, flapping its wings. He slowly raised his eyes and looked at Pei Chi-Chi. Then, he said 3 words very slowly. Sis? 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 Pei Chi-Chi looked at him and squatted down. She reached out to wipe the crumbs from the corner of Shin Zhongshan's mouth and smiled gently. Little Missy might have to leave. She had to leave this place, leave this city, because she couldn't breathe here. Mrs. Shun looked at her, then looked up at the sky. The white pigeons were flying freely in the blue sky. She suddenly said softly, Miss Pei, take care. Pei Chi-Chi's fingers paused for a moment. She grunted and slowly stood up. A few white pigeons were flapping their wings excitedly. The sunlight was too bright. She must have squatted for a while, but her vision was a little dark. She steadied herself for a while before she could stand up straight. When she got back, she was sweating profusely and fell asleep. She slept in the white ward. In her dreams, countless pigeons were flapping their wings around her. Little angels were singing a song of praise. The sound came from afar, and then from near to far. It was faintly discernible. Her body was ice-cold, but her forehead was constantly dripping with cold sweat. Tang Xian. Chapter 717. She breathed heavily and stared at the white wall in front of her. Tang Xian. Pei Chi took the phone beside her pillow and dialed Tang Xian's number. The phone rang one after another, but no one picked up. She lifted the blanket and got off the bed. Just as she got off the bed, she heard a message. Pei Chi immediately picked it up. It was a message from Tang Xian. Chi, where have you been? Dad sent me to America. It's so boring. He doesn't allow me to call him, so I can only send him messages secretly. Pei Chi looked at the few lines of words on it again and again before replying. I just came back to be city. Tang Xian chatted with her for a while, clinging to her in all kinds of ways. Pei Chi's eyes were moist. She didn't know how to tell Tang Xian that her child was gone, and she might not be able to save Tang Xian. She even thought that since she and Tang Yu were no longer together, she could find someone else to have another child. Her mind was filled with madness. After a long time, she calmed down and lay flat on the bed with the phone in her hand. She closed her eyes. She could still vaguely hear the voice of the little angel in her dreams, but it was getting further and further away. She didn't see Tang Yu again. He didn't come, so she didn't disturb him. Let's just leave it at that. After I sign it, I'll break it off cleanly. A week later, Tang Ziyuan came. He walked into the ward. Pei Chi had just drawn her blood once, and she saw him when she looked up. The atmosphere was a little uneasy and subtle. This man who used to be her father-in-law was actually her father? All this while, Tang Ziyuan didn't like her, and she didn't like Tang Ziyuan either. Even now, she couldn't bring herself to like him. Tang Ziyuan's mood was also very complicated. What the fuck? How could he be Pei Chi's father? 21 years ago, he didn't even know Zhao Ku at all. At that time, he and Yun Yun were very close. Every night when he came home, Zhao Ku didn't even touch a hair. How could there be Pei Chi? However, Tang Ziyuan could roughly guess Chi's background and Tang Xian's. If it was in the future, he would definitely be very angry. Being cuckolded by Zhao Ku and being a father time and time again. Any man would not be able to endure it. But now, he was calm. Everything was because he wasn't resolute enough. As for Pei Chi, he would treat it as him doing something for Tang Yu. Tang Ziyuan watched the nurse leave, then said softly, if the results come out in the afternoon, you can be discharged. I bought a quiet villa for you to live in. It's pretty good. Probably because he was really uncomfortable, Tang Ziyuan added, it's pretty good. Pei Chi looked at him, at this familiar yet strange man. She called him daddy because he was Tang Yu's father. She really couldn't connect herself with Tang Ziyuan. She couldn't imagine that this man had only given birth to her after having sex with Zhao Ku. The atmosphere was tense. Tang Ziyuan felt that this was really a difficult task. He touched his nose and said, you rest well. I'm going out for a smoke. After going out, he was much more at ease. Wasn't his son a little too picky? Brother and sister. How could he think of that? And his old face was flustered. Tang Yu had forcefully put the skewer on his head. Thinking about Tang Ziyuan's son and daughter fooling around behind closed doors. If this got out, he wouldn't be able to see anyone. But there was no other way. Chapter 718. Perhaps it was because he no longer had anyone by his side, so he thought it would be nice to dote on Pei Chi like a daughter. At least he wouldn't be so lonely. Tang Ziyuan got into character, but Pei Chi didn't. She couldn't accept it even if it was just a medical report. In the afternoon, Dr. May read the report, and said that she could be discharged. At that moment, her heart was relieved, but also a little heavy. The car slowly left Shengyuan Hospital. Tang Ziyuan and Pei Qiqi sat side by side in the back seat. Perhaps to ease the atmosphere, he patted her hand on her knee and comforted her. "Daddy will take care of you from now on." Pei Qiqi froze for a moment, then turned her head to look at him. After a long time, she said, "Can I stay with Tang Xian?" At that moment, Tang Ziyuan's face stiffened, and his muscles trembled unnaturally. There was even a hint of sorrow in his eyes. Pei Qiqi looked at him, her eyes carefully analyzing. Tang Ziyuan coughed lightly. "We'll talk about it when Tang Xian's condition stabilizes." Pei Qiqi took out her phone and dialed Tang Xian's number, but there was still no answer. But soon, she received a message. It was from Tang Xian. The more Pei Qiqi looked at the familiar words, the more panicked she became. His gaze quietly fell on Tang Ziyuan's face, causing him to feel flustered in his heart. "Stop the car!" Pei Qiqi suddenly shouted. The driver instinctively stopped the car, and Tang Ziyuan scolded, "Go back to Run's manor." But just as the driver was about to start the car, Pei Qiqi opened the door and got out. She ran desperately on the road. The cars on the road made warning beeps, but she didn't seem to hear it. She reached out and hailed a taxi. To the headquarters of Shengyuan. The taxi driver was in his 30s. Seeing that Tang Xian was a beauty, he couldn't help but say, "Shengyuan is a big company, and it seems like they're doing something big recently. I heard that they're going to have a marriage with Jin Taihe. In the future, the North won't be the only one." Pei Qiqi listened blankly. Marriage? There was a buzzing in her ears, and then she heard nothing. The world was like a traffic jam. It was motionless. There was not a single sound. Just like that, it was quiet. The driver in front was still talking. His lips kept moving, but she couldn't hear him. Very soon, the car arrived at Shengyuan building. Pei Qiqi opened the car door and alighted. The chauffeur said anxiously, "Miss, you haven't paid yet." However, Pei Qiqi couldn't hear it, nor did she turn around. "She's so pretty, so she's abnormal," the driver said angrily, then shook his head, admitting his bad luck. Pei Qiqi's appearance in Shengyuan Academy had shocked everyone in Shengyuan Academy. Even the receptionist was at a loss. This was the wife of the former president of Shengyuan. Even though they didn't know why she had divorced the president, the loving scene they shared in the past was still engraved in everyone's heart. The receptionist forced a smile. "Miss Pei, I'm sorry. You have to make an appointment to see the president." Pei Qiqi pushed her hand away. Her slim figure swayed into the elevator like a ghost. The elevator went straight to the top floor. Through the mirror on the wall of the elevator, she saw her pale eyes and empty gaze. The elevator door opened, and Xiao Ran stood in front of her. When Xiao Ran saw Pei Qiqi, he was shocked as well. It had been a long time since they last met, and yet she had become so skinny. It was as though she had lost her beauty. Chapter 719. Xiao Ran couldn't stop her. He thought to himself, "This has to happen eventually, so I might as well let her in." Pei Qiqi entered Tang Yu's office. He was sitting behind his desk. Of course, there were a few other executives. After Pei Qiqi rushed in, the executives couldn't take it anymore and left. As they walked past Pei Qiqi, they sighed in their hearts. In the CEO's heart, a beauty was no match for the empire. They didn't believe the rumors that were spreading. If the CEO couldn't even figure out whether a woman was his sister or not, and was still married, then he wouldn't be the CEO of Shengyuan. After everyone left, Pei Qiqi's gaze landed on a small phone beside Tang Yu's hand. That was Tang Xian's phone. At that moment, Pei Qiqi felt as if something was stuck in her throat. It was so uncomfortable that she couldn't breathe. She stared at it and slowly, step by step, she walked closer. She stopped in front of him and looked at him. Then, she picked up the phone. Her fingers were trembling. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to believe that it was possible. She would rather believe that it was a prank. The phone was warm, which meant that he had taken it not long ago. She opened it and saw the message. It was from Tang Xian. Tears slid down her cheeks. Silently, Silently, the tears fell. "Where's Tang Xian?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse and her eyes were burning as she stared at him. Tang Yu sat on his chair. He didn't move, in fact, he couldn't move either. He used to think that there was nothing in this world that he couldn't solve. Nothing could trouble him. But now, he was actually powerless to do anything. "Chi-Chi," he said. It was difficult for him to move. He knew that she would find out, but he didn't think that it would be so soon. Pei Chi-Chi's fingers tightened on the phone. Her tears kept falling and her voice was stern. "Where's Tang Xian?" He finally got up from his seat and slowly walked to her side. His large palm hesitated for a moment before he placed it on her shoulder. Pei Chi-Chi tilted her head and looked at his palm. "Chi-Chi." His voice was low. "Tang Xian is gone. Not here anymore." Pei Chi-Chi took a step back and looked up at him in shock. Although this was what she had guessed, when he said it out loud, her whole world collapsed. Tang Xian was gone. So, what was left of her? What else did she have? An omnipotent brother like Tang Yu? Or a father who could take care of her, Tang Ziyuan? She stepped back and looked at him stubbornly. Her voice was urgent. "I don't believe it. I don't believe a single word of it. Tang Yu, you lied to me. You lied to me." She couldn't help backing up. Her frail body trembled like a reed that could be snapped in the wind. His heart ached as he held her tightly in his arms. His face was close to hers. Her cheeks were covered with cold tears. It was the deepest pain in her heart. Chapter 720. At that moment, the pain in her shoulder was nothing compared to the pain in her heart. She cried and fell into his arms. The world was spinning. When Pei Chi-Chi woke up, she heard Tang Yu talking to someone. His voice was low and deep. "She's fine. Come and pick her up later." Then, there was silence. She opened her eyes and realized that she was sleeping in his room. Tang Yu was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling window with his back facing her. He was standing straight with his phone in his hand. His hand was hanging down, but his body did not move. She was still a little dizzy, but she forced herself to sit up and lifted the blanket. Her movement startled Tang Yu. He turned around, and there was a hint of pain in his eyes. Pei Chi-Chi raised her head and looked into his eyes. Time seemed to have stopped. She looked at him, and he looked back at her. Everything seemed to have stopped. After a long time, he walked over and took out a phone from his pocket. It was Tang Xian's phone. "Tang Xian left something for you. It's all in this phone." His voice was faint and a little hoarse. "Dad will come and pick you up later." He looked at her with deep love. If time stopped, he would be willing to pay any price for it. He looked at her one last time, turned around and forced himself to leave. Tang Ziyuan's car was already parked downstairs. "Tang Yu." Pei Chi-Chi stopped him. His body froze. He stood by the door and clenched his fists. She lifted the blanket and got out of bed. She walked over and looked up at him. There was a faint smile on her haggard face. It was a faint smile. "Tang Yu, should I congratulate you?" He suddenly turned around, and his eyes were stained with a touch of blood. "Chi-Chi, do you know that those few words of yours are enough to pierce my heart?" His pupils contracted, and he stared at her eyes. He was sure that she knew something. Pei Chi-Chi took a step back, reached out, and gently pulled out something from her neck. It was the jade he gave her. She forcefully pulled the necklace off her neck. The thin necklace cut into her delicate skin, causing beads of blood to seep out. However, she acted as if she didn't feel it and continued to smile faintly. "Big brother, congratulations." After that, she threw the thing in her hand to the ground. Broken, 4 or 5 into several pieces. Tang Yu was in a daze for a moment. His gaze fell on those fragments for a long time. Pei Chi-Chi stood there stubbornly and didn't ask for his explanation. It didn't matter anymore. The child was gone. Tang Xian was gone. He was going to get married. Tang Ziyuan pushed the door open and saw this scene. He secretly sighed in his heart. What a sin. He believed that Tang Yu's heart was torn apart like the things on the ground. The three of them were speechless for a long time. After a long time, Tang Ziyuan finally spoke. He went forward and put his arm around Pei Chi-Chi's shoulders. "Chi-Chi, Go back with Dad. As he said that, he felt a lump in his throat. Tang Xian was gone. He was willing to give all his fatherly love to Pei Chi-Chi. It could also be considered as taking care of her on behalf of Tang Yu. Pei Chi-Chi was still staring at Tang Yu. Her body was stiff, and she refused to move. Tang Ziyuan sighed in his heart. At this moment, Xiao Ran was trembling at the door. President, the meeting is about to start. I'll be there in a moment. Tang Yu's gaze was fixed on Pei Chi-Chi's face. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.